Everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this event on Global Perspectives, the first in our series, where we will cover Afghan-Russian relations. And I'm very pleased to be able to bring you my own colleague, Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center, Michael Kugelman, and our very special guest coming to us all the way from Kabul, Bismellah Alizada, who is the Deputy Director of DROPS. I'm going to say more about both of them in just a moment. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Matthew Rojansky. I'm director of the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. And this is a unique series where we take the opportunity not just to bring global perspectives to the policymaking world in Washington and the United States, but to bring global perspectives on Russia and Russia's relations with the rest of the world. Oftentimes we get blocked too much in our kind of bilateral two-way street of Washington and Moscow. And this is a chance to get out of that mold and take a look at things through an Afghan prism, which we're very lucky to be able to do with Bismellah today. Again, I want to thank Michael and the Asia program for co-hosting today's event. And before we get started on this discussion, I want to remind you, you can stay up to date with all of our work, our research and our publications, the work of all of our newest scholars, who are always coming in. Even now, amid the pandemic, we have new scholars coming in virtually and in person with precautions. We have a podcast called Kennan X, and our newest podcast, The Russia File, as well as our two blogs, one also named The Russia File and the other Focus Ukraine, with obvious focuses being different. I want to turn it over to Michael to introduce Bismellah, but first let me give you a little background on the famous Michael Kugelman. He's Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Asia program. His main areas of focus are Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, and of course, US relations with each of them. He's the editor or co-editor of 11 books and has written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications covering topics ranging from US policy in Afghanistan to terrorism, to water, energy, and food security in the region. And before I hand the floor to Michael, let me just remind everybody, I know we have a lot of viewers today and we've already started to get questions in. You can email questions at any time, including right now, to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet them at Kennan Institute or post them on our Facebook page, which is easy to find. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. It will make it more likely that your question will be asked. So without further ado, Michael, Bismellah, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Matt. I really appreciate you and the Kennan Institute for including me in today's event. It's a great pleasure to introduce Bismellah Alizada. He is truly one of Afghanistan's great young thought leaders, and in a country with Afghanistan's youthful demographics, where about 2/3 of the total population is under the age of 25, younger voices really matter, and they deserve to be amplified. Bismellah is the co-founder of Rahila Foundation, an organization working for youth empowerment through education and capacity building. And he is deputy director at the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, better known as DROPS, which is a research and advocacy organization based in Kabul. He's very prolific, and his articles have appeared in, among other outlets, Al Jazeera English and The Diplomat. And he is also, interestingly, co-translated into Persian, the book China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. So with no further ado, I know that Matt and I are really looking forward to what you have to say. So turn things over to you, Bismellah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to speak on this very timely and very critical issue of Afghanistan and Russia relations. I am really honored to be part of this discussion. So if I can share my screen. I hope everyone sees my screen right now. And if that's so, please let me know.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, perfect. So very briefly, I will be talking about the trajectory of post-2001 cooperation between Russia and Afghanistan in the fields of security, economic aid and reconstruction, and narcotics and drug trafficking. I will also be talking about sources of concerns for Russia, which will be basically around the topics of US and NATO presence and their bases here in Afghanistan and the region, terrorist threats from Afghanistan, narcotics and drugs. And then I will go towards looking at the prospects of Russia-Afghanistan relations, basically trying to focus on the multilateral platforms and the Afghan peace process and the uncertainty in the past few years. And then we're going to conclude and open up for discussions and questions. Basically, when the 2001, when the 9/11 happened, and then when the United States and NATO invaded Afghanistan, basically everything kind of like changed in the relationship between Afghanistan and Russia, because previously, when the Taliban regime was in power, Russia did not have a good relation with Afghanistan at all. So in the beginning, Russia took the opportunity to extend its cooperation with Afghanistan and with the Westerns in general. Russia had a cooperative attitude and cooperative behavior when it came to the issue of Afghanistan. It helped the US war on terror in Afghanistan that began in 2001, and then that went on afterwards. The reason for that was mainly two things. First of all, that the issue of Chechnya, because Taliban had close relations with Chechnyan rebels, or the Taliban had diplomatically at least supported their cause, and that was kind of like a trouble for Russia. But at the same time that the US invasion post 2001, post 9/11, was had created a situation in which Russia had no option but to actually at least apparently have a cooperative attitude towards the issues in Afghanistan. So what Russia did was it provided airspace for the NATO. It provided some bases, or it actually didn't provide bases really, but it gave a green light that the US and NATO could use some of the bases in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan and in Kyrgyzstan, and then land transport routes, so that the logistics of the NATO and US forces could be transported to Afghanistan via Russia. It's better known as the Northern Distribution Network. Also, in 2003, Russia went forward to blacklist Taliban. So Russia added Taliban to its blacklist of terrorist organizations. And during the 2004 Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, the decision was made. The motion was actually from Russia that Shanghai Cooperation Organization Afghanistan Contact Group be established. Also, the head of the interim government at that time, when it was Hamid Karzai, was invited to attend the summit, that particular summit, as a guest. In addition to that, Russia also provided military support that totaled between 2002 and 2005, a total $220 million worth of military equipment that was provided for the Afghan army. Later on in the summer of 2010, the United States bought 31 Mi-17 transport helicopters from Russia for the Afghan security forces. And then Pentagon announced that in April 2013, its intentions were to buy 30 additional Mi-17s from Russia for the Afghan security forces. the Northern Distribution Network played rather more significant role in 2009 through 2013, up until the withdrawal in 2014. In 2009, the NDN actually 40% of the non-lethal equipment of the international security forces, and more generally the logistics to the ISAF, came through the Northern Distribution Network. And 1 year later, 2 years later, in 2011, it peaked to more than 50%, which means that basically 50% of the logistics of the international forces came through that particular network with the help or with the cooperation of Russia, better to say. In 2011, the United States also agreed to purchase 21 military helicopters from Russia, in addition to the other ones that I just mentioned, to help equip the Afghan security forces. Another very important case is the Manas Air Base, which was located in Kyrgyzstan, that the US forces used for quite some years. In 2009, Kyrgyz officials warned that they might close the base down, but then because of an increase in the lease of that particular airbase, it was not closed down at that time. But then in 2014, this was closed down by the Kyrgyz Republic, and apparently under pressures from Russia, under both pressures and incentives from Russia. In 2009, when the Kyrgyz officials announced that this base would be closed down, Russia offered Kyrgyzstan $2 billion loan as an incentive to do so. And in December 2009, NATO Secretary General at that time visited Moscow to ask, or to make a request for the Russian officials to increase the logistical support for coalition forces in Afghanistan. But apparently that was turned down by Putin and by Russia generally. In 2013, actually Afghanistan got a bit closer to the Russians, and in May 2013, during the Collective Security Treaty Organization Summit, members actually began to discuss the measures to be adopted to minimize the negative impact of military withdrawal from Afghanistan by the end of December 2014. So this means that by that time, actually there were some concerns, some very serious concerns as to what would happen if there is a quick or irresponsible withdrawal from Afghanistan by the international forces. Afghanistan was also becoming part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in those years, as the relationship between Afghanistan and the United States deteriorated during the second years of Karzai. So Karzai had this tendency to get closer to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also to Russia. So this is one aspect, but at the same time, Russia also had some links with the Taliban, meaning that as Russia began to grow suspicious of the US and suspicious of the bases that the US intended to make in Afghanistan, but also its presence in the bases in Central Asian countries. So Russia grew suspicious of those activities and the bases and the presence generally. So it began apparently in 2007 for the first time begin establishing contacts with Taliban, and later on this continued in and they had meetings in Tajikistan and United Arab Emirates during 2016, for instance. So later on in 2014, 2015, 2016, there were reports that that these meetings with the Taliban were not limited to meetings only, but also some sort of support that the Russians provided for the Taliban, which, according to New York Times, for instance, included night vision goggles, arm-piercing ammunitions, and so on. But this is a contentious issue, and not everyone agrees. Russians, of course, have rejected all this stuff. In addition to the security issues, Russia, from a different perspective, we can also look at the relationship between Afghanistan and Russia in the past 2 decades in terms of economic aid and reconstruction. At the beginning, when the first donor conference was held in Afghanistan in Tokyo in 2002, Russia at that time was not very much interested in pledging aid to Afghanistan. And mainly it was said by the Russian officials that the 9.8 billion or close to $10 billion debt that Afghanistan had to Russia was the main reason. But then gradually that issue was resolved in 2007. In August 2007, Russia wrote off that debt. And then, so between 2002 and 2005, Russia engaged in some sort of aid to Afghanistan that, according to some sources, amount to around $200 million in various sectors, including the buildup of the Afghan army, and then also other assistance in civilian sectors between 2002 and 2009 that equals to $109 million. In the early years of Karzai, meaning before, from 2002 to 2011, as many as 17 bilateral agreements were signed between the two countries. Russia also held the CSO Summit on Reconstruction of Afghanistan. It was facilitated by Russia, and in that particular summit, 36 countries participated, and there were pledges made that Russia and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would help Afghanistan in various sectors. And in 2010, Karzai, as the president of Afghanistan at that time, had a trip to Russia. He was invited, actually, and then a bilateral agreement was signed by Russia between the two countries in the areas of trade and cooperation. And in between 2004 and 2011, the trade peaked almost to $1 billion between the two countries, the trade volume, which was 12 times bigger than it was in 2004. But generally, in terms of economic aid and reconstruction aid, Russia has not been among the top donors in Afghanistan. So Russia has been lackluster, generally to speak. And up until 2012, the total thing, according to some sources, reaches 150 million US dollars, based on which Russia will be the 22nd in the ranking among donors to Afghanistan. So this is not significant at all. A third angle from which we can look at the relations between Afghanistan and Russia would be narcotics and drug trafficking, which is one of the biggest worries of Russia. There was an agreement between the two countries in 2009 to combat illicit trade in narcotics and drugs. And by 2012, in almost 3 years, 10 military exercises were then conducted by the two countries. And then a new cooperation in other spheres, such as the fight against money laundering and maintenance of security, and other stuff are also added to those cooperations. So this actually provides a general picture of the relationship between the two countries, although it's very brief, but it just gives a picture of how these two countries had relations in the past 2 decades, and mostly during Karzai. And we will come back to President Ashraf Ghani's term later on. But Russia had some sources of concern, among which is the US and NATO presence and bases, as I briefly mentioned before. So as early as 2005, Russia grew concerned about these bases and about the US and NATO presence in its periphery, as it speaks. And then during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, a deadline was set, or it was requested by them that the US and international forces set a deadline for their withdrawal. And the US was also asked to close down its airbase in Uzbekistan in November that same year. In 2006, Russia grew more concerned about the US long-term presence in Central Asia, particularly when it came to Manas airbase in Kyrgyzstan. Russian officials pointed out to the series of color revolutions, for instance, between 2002 and 2005, particularly in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And then they, at least rhetorically, they were showing that they were suspicious of the US being behind these revolutions. That's why undermining Moscow's influence and potentially undermining its national security. There were also some signs as of 2010 between Russia, India, and Iran, some sort of cooperation to respond to a potential breakdown of the Afghan state, where one possibility lies in rekindling the remnants of the Northern Alliance. Although this issue is also a bit controversial and not everyone agrees that this has been the case, but there were some sort of cooperation between Russia, India, and Iran as the Taliban proved to steadily grow in their military capabilities in those years. But since 2012, the US and Russian relations has not been so good, and this has projected itself onto the Russian relation with Afghanistan. Another source of threat is terrorist threats. The Taliban regime's recognition of Chechen Republic of Ichkeria as a separate country in January of 1999 was a major source of concern at that time for Russia. And later on, the Taliban foreign minister, Wakil Ahmad Mutawakkil, clearly said that the Chechens are their brothers and that they are Muslims, and that the only way to help them is the only solution actually is to help the Chechens. So there were also claims, although not corroborated really, that the Taliban sent troops to Chechnya actually in 1999, but I don't know how solid that claim might be. But post 2001 and over the last 2 decades, this threat of terrorism has grown much more for the Russians, because there are a few terrorist organizations in Central Asian countries, including Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, about which Russia is really concerned. For example, in Uzbekistan, there is the Union of Islamic Jihad, and there is the Islamic Jihad, there's the Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is estimated to have between 3,000 to 5,000 members in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and between 7,000 to 60,000 members, according to some sources, in Uzbekistan. And there is Katiba Imam Bukhari, which is another group actually in Uzbekistan. These groups have over the years have carried some few terrorist attacks in these countries. And in Kyrgyzstan in 2010, members of the Jaish al-Mahdi claimed responsibility for a few terrorist attacks in that country. In 2016 as well, members of the Katibat al-Tawhid al-Jihad, they also claim responsibility for terror attacks. Kazakhstan has not been an exception either, although presence of such groups in that particular country is fewer, but there are groups like Jund al-Khalafat, which had some attacks in Kazakhstan and in 2016 as well. And some of these groups, some of the sympathizers and members of these groups also joined the ISKP in Afghanistan. And as of 2018, it was estimated that as many as 4,000 of them had joined the ISKP and were fighting along other jihadists inside Afghanistan under the banner of ISKP. So this, although it's not a very, very big issue at the moment, but it has the potential to become a very big issue. And a third source of concern for Russia is narcotics and drug trafficking, which is also a very important thing because a very important thing in the relationship between Afghanistan and Russia, because Afghanistan is a source of these drugs that are being produced and then trafficked. Of the 100,000 people, of the 100,000 addicts around the world who die because of using drugs, it's estimated that 40,000 of them, as many as 40,000 of them, are Russians every year. And according to some sources, actually 6% of the Russian population as of 2013 were classified as drug addicts, according to Russians themselves. And as many as 7.2 million heroin addicts in 2012. So this is this seems to be a very big concern for Russia. On a daily basis, some research shows that 80 people die per day from use of drugs. But at the same time, it's helping a spike in cases of HIV/AIDS in Russia. So these are the concerns that the Russians have when it comes to Afghanistan. But given these concerns and given the history of Russia-Afghanistan relations in the past 2 decades, how does the prospects look like for cooperation between these two countries? I think there are some potential areas of cooperation. One is the multilateral platforms that the two countries are members of, among which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China and Afghanistan, Afghanistan is a member, an observer member, and China and Russia, sorry, is a founding member. And another one is the, which is very important for Russians, is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and Afghanistan became an observing member in that particular organization in 2013. A third joint platform is the Kabul Process for Peace and Stability in Afghanistan that was initiated in 2017 and then in 2018. So far, it has had 2 rounds of meetings, and Russia has participated in both of those. And a fourth one is the Heart of Asia Istanbul Process, and Russia is also a member of that. So these multilateral platforms provide some ground for cooperation between the two countries, but this is not for granted, of course. And it depends on various other factors to have Russia actually cooperate. Russians have also showed their interest in the Afghan peace process, and they have held a few different trilateral and bilateral, as well as other sorts of talks on the Afghan peace process in February 2017, for instance, and in November 2018, they also hosted the Moscow talks, where in which the Taliban and representatives of a few other countries participated. In February 2019, Russia hosted another meeting, which was attended by the Taliban delegation, which also got a huge media coverage. But since 2014, when President Ashraf Ghani came to power, Russians have grown more suspicious of the intentions of Afghanistan, so to say. In 2014, Afghanistan, at that time it was President Karzai, Afghanistan recognized the annexation of Crimea. But after that, it was not really as the Russians expected it to be. So Afghanistan got a bit closer to the US. And because the US and Russia had conflicts in Eastern Ukraine and in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, so these relations actually soured and soured and soured. So President Ghani has not met President Putin officially yet, but on the sidelines of some other meetings like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they have met, which also speaks of some sort of cold relationship between the two countries. Afghanistan has made some requests to Russians to help the country in terms of supplies, military and stuff, but it's unclear if those requests have been responded to positively. One more thing that's important here is that over these years, Russians have stepped up their relationships and their support for the Taliban. So that also speaks of how the relationship between the two countries have been. To conclude, one is the uncertainty around the issue of Afghanistan at the moment with regards to the peace process and the negotiations that's going on. So basically, Russia generally might be waiting and seeing. So that would be the for now, at least for the short term, Russia will be waiting and seeing as to how to define its relationship with Afghanistan, because it's unsure, and everyone is unsure actually, as to how the future state and the reconfiguration of the state in Afghanistan would look like. But generally speaking, Russia seems to be more comfortable dealing with some sort of like autocratic kind of like government rather than a democratic one in Afghanistan. This is somehow plausible. But another issue that's very important in this case is the vacuum that will be created in here after the full withdrawal of the foreign troops, and in case of a breakdown of the negotiations and talks. So that would be another scenario that would really define how Russia will actually approach Afghanistan when it comes to its foreign policy. Basically, Russia wants to expand its clout and its influence and its presence beyond Central Asia and onto Afghanistan, Iran in the Middle East. Afghanistan is included, but it's really unclear as to how Russia will do it, because there is another power here, which is China, sorry. So China is also trying to expand its clout and its influence onto Central Asia, among others, and Afghanistan. So, geostrategically, it looks to be a little bit some sort of like balancing between these two countries when it comes to the issue of Afghanistan, because the two countries, meaning China and Russia, also share the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a platform that might help them go in a coordinated, at least in a coordinated manner, or if not in a coordinated manner, when it comes to the issue of Afghanistan, maybe in a balanced manner, so as not to reach any point of clash or conflict when it comes to the issue of Afghanistan. So in short, this is how I see the prospects of relationship between these two countries as of now. I will open it. I'm sorry that it took a bit longer than I intended it to take, but I am happily opening the ground for questions now.
Great, Bismellah, I think we'll go now to Michael for a comment. And let me actually just remind everybody that you can email your questions to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet them at Kennan Institute or ask them on Facebook. Go ahead, Michael, and I'd say with 25 minutes or so, we're still good to take plenty of questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Well, Bismellah, I thought that was a terrific presentation, rich, broad, comprehensive. In the U.S. these days, media coverage and other commentary on Russia-Afghanistan relations tends to be dominated by these accusations of Moscow's military support to the Taliban, and that focus, of course, has been heightened in the aftermath of the Russia bounty allegations. But clearly there's a lot more to this relationship that warrants attention, and I think that Bismellah has done a great job of unpacking this very complex relationship. Just one thought, one thing that kept coming to mind while listening to Bismellah's presentation is that if the US-Russia relationship were in a better place, that there may be so much greater scope for cooperation between Washington and Moscow in Afghanistan. And that's because the two really see eye to eye on many issues in Afghanistan. And this came through in Bismellah's presentation. Both the US and Russia support a more stable and prosperous Afghanistan. Both of them support the current peace process. They're both open to a political settlement that entails some degree of Taliban power. And both the US and Russia really worry about ISIS in Afghanistan and about the drug trade as well. And what I'm saying here about opportunities for cooperation squandered by toxic diplomatic relations, I think this can actually apply equally to the US and Iran. Tehran, like Moscow, shares many of the same interests and goals with Washington in Afghanistan. So it's not a surprise that during the early years of the US-led war, which incidentally marks its 19-year anniversary today, before the US-Russia relationship took a major tumble, there was actually considerable levels of cooperation, which I think Bismellah laid out very nicely. So I think that, only after things changed, only after Russia annexed the Crimea, after the Syrian war intensified, and these and other factors made the US-Russia relationship really go south. Only after all this has it become more difficult for the US and Russia to cooperate in Afghanistan. And the public narratives change as well. There were times when Russia was publicly praising US security policies in Afghanistan, but then then those public narratives turned a lot more negative. And more recently, Russia has criticized the US for its handling of the very delicate political situation in Afghanistan, such as the US decision to recognize the victory of Ashraf Ghani after the recent Afghan presidential election that Ghani's main rival, Abdullah, rejected as fraudulent. But even despite all this, it's notable that the US and Russia have continued to cooperate on modest levels in Afghanistan. They've participated in some informal consultations to try to figure out how to move the needle forward on the peace process. And also another thing that strikes me is when you look at the main manifestations of Russia's current actions in Afghanistan, they don't necessarily strike me as being moves meant to be hostile to the US. Yes, we know that in recent years, Russia has been reaching out to the Taliban. US military officials were accusing Russia of arming the Taliban long before the bounty allegations came out. And what seems to be happening now is that Russia is engaging with the Taliban. But the question is that engagement with the Taliban, including the possibility of arming the Taliban, is it meant to undercut the US and poke its finger in Washington's eye? I'm sure that's part of the reason, but there's clearly more to it as well. It seems to me, and a recent Pentagon report sort of amplified this, Russia's main security concern, Russia's engagement with the Taliban is part of a broader hedging strategy that entails casting a wide net in Afghanistan and reaching out to actors across the board, both state and non-state actors. It wants to ensure leverage and influence over a wide array of actors in advance of a US withdrawal that's likely to make Afghanistan a more unstable and complex place, especially if, as is likely, that withdrawal takes place in the absence of a Taliban peace deal. And also in the ISIS factor, which I think Bismellah laid out very nicely. I mean, clearly, it seems to me Russia's main security concern in Afghanistan right now is arguably not the Taliban, but ISIS Khorasan, the Afghanistan faction of ISIS. ISIS-K has attracted Central Asian recruits, and that's concerning to Russia. So it seems to me that Russia is playing the same game in Afghanistan that other regional actors like Iran and Pakistan and even China are playing. They're trying to build out influence and leverage by engaging with actors across the board, both state and non-state. Certainly, though, I think it's quite clear, and I'll start to wrap up here, it's quite clear that US-Russia tensions do preclude greater cooperation in Afghanistan. And in fact, US cooperation with Afghanistan's regional partners on the whole is constrained by toxic relations. It's a notable fact that many of America's most bitter rivals, not just Russia, but also Iran and China, they happen to be regional partners or regional neighbors of Afghanistan's. And though the US sees eye to eye with them on many levels in Afghanistan, prospects for broader cooperation are limited, and particularly with the US heading for the exits in Afghanistan. And so with the US heading for the exits, I see two scenarios for Afghanistan-Russia relations in terms of how they evolve. One is that the US leaves, there's no peace process. I think we'd likely see the same type of Russia-Afghanistan relationship we see now, which is Russia doing what it can to secure its interests by engaging with a variety of actors. The other more ideal scenario for Russia-Afghanistan relations would emerge if there is a peace deal in Afghanistan, a huge if, as this would entail more stability. It would enable Moscow and Kabul to work more closely together, potentially operationally on the ground, and particularly to cooperate on regional connectivity projects with China and Pakistan as well. Connectivity, especially in terms of the development of projects that better link Afghanistan to Central and South Asia, is something the US supports, but it has not really been very present on this, aside from a few US-backed connectivity projects like the TAPI pipeline and the CASA 1000 project. So I think, ironically, unless US relations improve with its bitter rivals, its most bitter rivals, the US could well find itself locked out of the very type of regional cooperation that it wants to see take shape through more connectivity and integration projects. I'll wrap up there. Just one sort of question to throw out there in case Bismellah would like to address it during the discussion is Afghan public perceptions of Russia. We know that the war, the Soviet occupation, those memories still loom very large in the minds of many Afghans. Be curious to hear how you would assess Afghan public perceptions of Russia and this idea of Russia trying to build more influence in Afghanistan, particularly how those perceptions play out along demographic levels. If you sense differences in terms of older Afghans feel about Russia versus the younger generation. So thank you. Back to you, Matt.
That was excellent, Michael. And I actually think, so we have 15 minutes and a lot of questions coming in. So what I'll try to do is actually weave a lot of questions together, and I may not cite the questioner, but let's actually start with Michael's last question because we had several people ask about that, Bismellah. If you can briefly, just a couple of minutes, answer the set of questions that have to do with, number one, this legacy, right? Russia, the Soviet Union waged a war in Afghanistan. How much does that still resonate in terms of public perceptions? How are those perceptions shaped today? And then when we talk about Russia seeking influence by possibly playing patronage to the Taliban, how is that perceived both by the government and by people? And I thought Michael's refinement asking across social groups or ethnic groups, that's also very interesting. I know that's a lot. Give us what you can in just a couple minutes.
Thank you for the question. Well, it's so difficult to talk about perception of the Russians in Afghanistan because there has not been any perception survey really. So what I would tell you right now would be based on my own interactions with people, with very limited number of people from limited number of provinces maybe, and mostly limited to Kabul. So this would not be representative of the Afghan people at all. But two things are important here. One is the legacy of the 10-year war of the Russians in Afghanistan, which is dark, and I mean a majority of the Afghans, particularly the older generation, who had seen it in one or the other way, who had experienced it in one or the other way, they do not have any good memories from those times. So that's one. But the other thing is the comparison that people usually make between the Russian invasion and the US invasion. And usually I have heard people talking about how Russia were more honest in terms of investing in some infrastructure projects. So this is how some people think, at least, about how the Russian projects were more channeled towards some infrastructure plans and infrastructure stuff, and that the US, although like the amount of money that came with the US presence in Afghanistan, a huge amount of it was either squandered through corruption, or it was spent just on security expenses and stuff. So like some people draw this comparison and come to the conclusion, although it's not a very solid conclusion, but they come to the conclusion that the Russians had better intentions for Afghanistan, and, at least in terms of reconstruction and infrastructure, but the US doesn't. But when it comes to the Russia's relations with the Taliban, I think this does not get a lot of attention in the sense that every other country, including Iran, including Pakistan, including the Gulf, including the United States itself, they in one or the other way actually have a similar situation when it comes to the issue of Taliban. So the Russia does not really, is in the people's perception, Russia does not, I mean, people don't single Russia out in the case of like supporting Taliban, because so many other countries do. And that this support of the Russians for the Taliban is not as evidenced and as strongly actually put out in the open as the other supports, like the Pakistan support for the Taliban is. So I think this is not a very big factor, although it's not negligible, but it's not a very big factor in terms of how people perceive of Russia in Afghanistan. But none of this would be representative of the Afghan people. None of these stuff would be representative of how Russia is perceived in Afghanistan. There has not been any methodological study or survey of the perception of people when it comes to Russia.
Bismellah, if you don't mind, I'm going to come back to both of you in just a second with another kind of big geopolitical question, but we have a specific question from a journalist, Aram Avatisian of Voice of America, asking, since Afghanistan is an observer, as you mentioned, Bismellah, in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, of which Armenia is a full member. Armenia, of course, now is at war with Azerbaijan. So this journalist asks that is demanding exclusion of Afghanistan from the CSTO because I guess Kabul is supporting Azerbaijan in that conflict. First of all, is that accurate? And second, what response do you expect from Moscow? Is Afghanistan going to be kicked out or sidelined from the CSTO?
I don't think so. But first of all, it's very unclear because Afghanistan has not officially supported Azerbaijan in this conflict. But the cases that Afghanistan, the balancing of relations between Afghanistan, Turkey, and Afghanistan, Russia here is very difficult for the Afghan government. That's why I think diplomatically, at least, the Afghan government has said that it encourages the two sides to resolve this conflict diplomatically and politically. So there has not been some sort of like any sort of support for the Azerbaijan from the Afghan government. And I think this issue is not so big at the time, particularly when you look at it from Afghanistan. It's not so big at a time that can have repercussions as to expulsion of Afghanistan from the CSTO or from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I don't think so. I don't agree.
Thank you very much, Bismellah. Let me take this opportunity. There are several questions as well that relate to essentially, they either use the term great game or geopolitical competition, or what are the motives for the United States to stay in Afghanistan potentially. I just want to lay it out. You know, we have obviously Russia, China, and the United States, all of which have kind of projected visions for what the future of kind of inner Asia should look like, right? Some more explicitly engaging Afghanistan in that scenario. You know, obviously the Chinese One Belt, One Road vision, et cetera. And then of course we have India as well, you know, a very significant rising power. What is your sense about Afghanistan as kind of the continuing central node in the Central Asian or sort of inner Asian great game of geopolitics, if you will? Do you think that that's a story from the past that's kind of not an appropriate metaphor for the future going forward, or do you think we're still engaged in that type of inevitable confrontation of proxy forces in Afghanistan that represent, you know, bigger outside powers? I'd open that to both of you.
Well, first of all, I think in the immediate future, this is not possible. In the immediate future, we will have definitely have the continuation of these proxy wars and conflicts as it has been going on for the past decades. There is a potential. Afghanistan certainly is geographically located in, I mean, it has that geographic location advantage. But this does not mean that the mere geographic location advantage will turn Afghanistan into a hub, into a trade and transit hub that can link South Asia to Central Asia and beyond, and that can link China to the Middle East and beyond. So that is, it is a thing of the past, definitely, but it's also a thing of the future, but it's not a thing of the present, and it's not a thing of the immediate future at all, because of the confrontations that we see. And I personally see no good prospects for these confrontations that we see to ease very soon. So I see that I sort of like see it in a way more divided than integrated in the immediate future, because of how the relationship between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, and how these relationships really play out in this region, particularly in South Asia and Central Asia and the Middle East. All these stuff actually goes towards more confrontational and divisive situation, not towards a situation in which integration and connectivity and cooperation would overtake. So at least in the immediate future, at least in short term, I don't see any prospects for such a good thing to happen. Really, it would be a good thing to happen, but I don't see any signs for now.
Michael, do you want to hop in on this question?
Yeah, very briefly. I largely agree with what Bismellah said, but I think that on this question, everything really depends on the fate of the peace talks underway now. If there's no peace deal, and if there is a peace deal in Afghanistan, I think it would take a long time to come. If there's no peace deal, then these various countries, Russia and Iran and China India, Pakistan, they'll continue to pursue their interests in ways that they have to that could be destabilizing. And that's particularly the case with India and Pakistan, where there's already talk about the risk of some type of proxy war. If there's a peace deal in Afghanistan, that allows, I think that heightens the prospects for cooperation between some of these countries on issues like promoting regional connectivity in Afghanistan and beyond. But with the US on its way out and its future role unclear, the US may not be very present and involved in those types of efforts.
Bismellah, I want to come to you with quite an inside baseball question, if you will. Giuliano Bifolci of the University of Rome is asking how you interpret the appointment of a new Russian ambassador in Afghanistan, Dmitry Zhirnov, who Professor Bifolci says worked in the United States and speaks both English and Chinese as the new ambassador in Afghanistan. Does that signal something in terms of underscoring the U.S.-China rivalry over Afghanistan, an attempt to maybe play that by Russia? What do you read from this appointment?
Actually, it's very difficult for now to really assess what that move would mean. But generally, I think Russia would want to play a bolder role when it comes to the Afghan peace process, when it comes to the whole thing with regards to Afghanistan. That's why I think someone who knows the language of the Americans, who are a major party in these talks, whether we like it or not, they are a major party in these talks, and the Chinese are also a major party in these talks. They have a say in the talks generally. So someone from the Russians who can speak the language of both of these two countries and who can have a greater, who can display a greater potential of interactions and negotiations, basically the skills of negotiations with these powers. I think that would be this current option for the Russians, the new ambassador. So I don't see it as a big change really in the approach of Russia when it comes to Afghanistan and the peace process and stuff, but just as a move that Russia would like to, a move that would give Russia the opportunity to step in more boldly and to be able to really juggle in this process. So that will be giving Russia that edge in these difficult negotiations actually with these powers.
Well, Russian diplomats are, famously talented, and for that reason, the Russians, I think, are wise. When they find the right diplomat, they usually keep them for a lot longer than we do in the United States. We rotate them in and out very fast. We have just 2 minutes left, and I want to ask for both of your final thoughts on what may be the most important question for Americans. And that is, with some number of American troops apparently likely to remain somehow or other in Afghanistan, how do you think the Russian factor plays into that? Are the Russians looking to do things, for example, the bounties story, which we all heard about, that might kind of kick the Americans out the door? Or conversely, would the Russians like to see the Americans stick around because we're doing things that, as you pointed out, Bismellah, the Russians might want to see happen anyway? How do you assess the Russian factor in the future of American presence in Afghanistan?
In short, it's very difficult to really see the future through the prism of the present, because the present is so uncertain. So I don't see anything clear as to how the Russian factor will play out when it comes to that scenario. But generally, I think when Russia is sure that the U.S. Or the future Afghan state makes sure that the U.S. will not harm the Russian interests in Afghanistan, or that the U.S. presence in Afghanistan would not harm the Russians, both in Afghanistan and beyond, that would be the defining factor. Because if the U.S. and Russia gets to the agreement, some sort of agreement on that, or if the Russians and the future Afghan state gets to any sort of agreement that makes that assurance, then I think the Russians would not have any problem with that presence ready. But if that's not achieved, I think the Russians would do anything they can, maybe that not bounty, but anything they can to undermine that presence and to try to show that this presence is harmful for Afghanistan and the region, so as to force the US out, or to try to force the US out if they.
Just to, forgive me for this, Bismellah, but just to be clear, are you saying you're skeptical about the bounty story? You don't think the Russians are doing that, and you certainly don't think they're doing it to kick the Americans out?
I'm not skeptical about the bounties, but the point is that, I mean, according to the best estimates, even if the bounty story had been real, 12 American soldiers had been killed, I mean, due to those bounties. So some of the estimates. But this is a really new story, and it's suspicious because it came out from the CIA and those intelligence sources. So it's not that we doubt it or we really believe in it, but it's that we should wait and see more evidence. I mean, we don't have enough evidence, because the evidence comes only from one source, which is the
Right.
CIA. So we would need to wait and see more evidence as to this. So it will be premature for now, at least. It will be premature for us to either believe or disbelieve this story.
Okay. Can't imagine why Afghans wouldn't automatically trust the CIA. Michael, final word to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'm also skeptical of the Russia bounty story, just because it seems hard to believe that the Taliban would be taking money from the Russians to target U.S. troops at the very moment when the Taliban was negotiating an agreement with the U.S. to get the Americans out of Afghanistan, which is something that the Taliban really wants. Bottom line is that any future U.S. military presence in Afghanistan would largely revolve around a goal that is also a goal of Russia, and that is counterterrorism, contributing to efforts to fight against ISIS and like-minded groups. So theoretically, one would expect there to be the two, Russia and the U.S., to see eye to eye on that type of thing. But for the reasons that we've discussed, given the toxicity in this bilateral relationship, that would not necessarily translate to Russia being supportive, even if U.S. troops are there doing things that Russia would support. So thanks.
Good. Well, I think we have to end there for time. Bismellah, we're very grateful to you for coming to us late at night from Kabul. Michael, thank you so much. And thanks to the Asia program for co-sponsoring the event. And thanks to our whole team for keeping us running smooth and on time. So with that, I'll declare an end to our discussion. Thank you again so much. Bye-bye.